Earlier this week, Sony discontinued the PS3 in Japan, which, for all intents and purposes, basically means the system is officially dead.
Oh! I killed it!
After having absolutely dominated the 6th generation of consoles with the PlayStation 2, Sony was prepared to try and continue this winning streak when they unveiled the original PS3. Now, the one they showed here isn't actually the one we got released a year later. This model was all silver, it had this extremely weird and uncomfortable looking boomerang-like controller, and featured a whopping 6 USB ports, 2 HDMI ports, and 3 Ethernet ports. What we got instead were a pair of models that were extremely expensive for their time, running at $500 and $600. That puts the lower end model at a full $100 more than what the 360 was asking for with their highest end. Now, both these systems had a lot of things in common. They both had 4 USB ports, both of them offered complete hardware backwards compatibility with PS2, but there were a few very important key differences between them. The more expensive model offered a 60GB hard drive, built-in Wi-Fi, a card reader, and had chrome trim, while the cheaper model only had a 20GB hard drive, lacked those additional features, and was completely all black. Now, if you take a cursory glance at the history of the PS3, you might think there's only 3 different models: the original fat ones, the slims, and the super slims. But really, there's a lot more than that because the original fat models had a lot of different generations. After the first 2 that came out at launch, a year later, they released another model that was pretty close to being the same as the 60GB, except it offered an 80GB hard drive and removed the hardware backwards compatibility in favor of software. What this means is basically it still plays PS2 games, but some select titles wouldn't entirely work right, and some of which were completely unplayable. A year after this one, they did an even more trimmed down system that only had 2 USB ports, ditched backwards compatibility entirely, and came out in a couple other hard drive sizes like 40 and 120, and eventually started shipping with the new DualShock 3 controller, which had a vibration function. Now, while this one did trim down a lot of features, in some ways it was actually the best one because it was much more power efficient, a lot quieter, and didn't have nearly as many model faults involving the yellow light of death. Now, the reason for all these different models early on is because the early years of the PS3's life cycle were not very kind to it. It had a lot of issues. First off, it was very, very expensive compared to the other systems at the time, and it was a full year behind them. The 360 and the Wii were both already out for a year and were big successes for different reasons. The 360 was embracing the online multiplayer community, adding things like achievements and gamer profiles, while the Wii was a huge hit with families. The PS3 didn't excel at either of these things. What it did have going for it is that it was actually the most powerful system of its generation, being the only one to embrace Blu-ray and made use of a very powerful cell processor, which was actually also kind of its downside because it presented a challenge for third-party companies to develop for it. As a result, the PS3 lost a lot of third-party support. Oftentimes games would come out late on the PS3 compared to the 360, and even when a game was made multi-platform on both systems, it would oftentimes run smoother on the 360 despite the PS3 being the stronger system. On the flip side, what few exclusive games the PS3 had were absolutely stunningly beautiful, with big hits like Metal Gear Solid 4, the original Uncharted, Resistance: Fall of Man, and near the end of its life cycle, the big fan cult hit Demon's Souls, the precursor to Dark Souls. Now, as you might imagine, after the wild success that was the PS2, a lot of people built up a ton of hype for whatever Sony was doing next, especially after already having a year with their competition. And what they got for those first 3 years left a really bad taste in a lot of people's mouths, and there was a ton of hate for the PS3 early on. And Sony really needed to rebrand their image hard, which they started to do in 2009 with the release of the PS3 Slim. Now, this model continued the downsizing that was seen in the last original model. It still only had 2 USB ports, no PS2 backwards compatibility whatsoever, and dropped even more functions like supporting Linux OS. In exchange though, the system was much more power efficient, a lot more quiet, and was a slimmer, lighter, much better looking build. In fact, I really think the Slim model PS3 is by far the best looking one. This alone was a step in the right direction, but what really helped change Sony's image was alongside this, we also finally got to see a lot of really awesome exclusive games on the PS3 that made people want to switch over, including awesome sequels to some of their biggest franchises like God of War 3 and Uncharted 2, as well as brand new IPs that were really successful like Infamous. I didn't mention Spider-Man font. I could just do a really quick ending like, not to mention it thankfully got rid of the Spider-Man font. Now, near the end of its life cycle, the PS3 did receive one more model change, and that was the Super Slim. Internally, this was pretty much the same thing as the Slim. Same power draw, same number of ports, same benefits and strengths. The big change though was the exterior. It was a little smaller, it was much lighter, and most importantly, noticeably cheaper. While the Slim was an approach to try and make the system the best it could be, but also trimmed down, the Super Slim was trying to trim down the system as much as possible to make it as cheap as possible to produce so people could buy it at a low price near the end of the life cycle in preparation for the PS4's impending launch in 2013. Now the way they did this is the exterior is noticeably kind of a cheaper plastic, it just doesn't look as good, and instead of having a self-loading drive, it instead had a sliding top with a top-loading disc, which made it much cheaper to produce. During the end of this lifetime, we still saw a lot of good games come out on the PS3. We got a ton of JRPGs just flooding in at the last second. We got one of the best games on PS3, The Last of Us, and it was at this time that Sony also discovered the glory that is HD remasters. All of this together led to what was, in all honesty, an incredible comeback for the system. What went from being one of the most reviled consoles of its generation became a huge success that equaled out with the 360. By the end of its life cycle, both of them had basically the same worldwide sales. The 360 won in North America, but the PS3 beat it out in Europe and in Japan. Especially considering the fact that it had a year less to do this, it was pretty awesome.